Her supervisor sent her into the lethal storm alone, never realizing the man watching from the black sedan was the Korean Mafia Boss who had been searching for her for 3 years. The rain fell in heavy, punishing sheets over Seoul that night. The neon signs of the Gangnam district blurred into watery streaks of red and blue, and the wind howled through the skyscrapers like a predator. Most people were safely tucked away in warm apartments, sheltering from the flash flood warnings, but not Aria Vale. She stood in her supervisor's cramped, fluorescent-lit office, her shoulders trembling with a fatigue that went bone-deep. She had been on her feet for 14 hours, her simple server, uniform still damp from a previous delivery. Her supervisor didn't even look up from his desk. With a sneer, he shoved a heavy, velvet-lined package into her arms and pointed toward the street. "Deliver this to the penthouse on the north side, or consider your father's medical bills someone else's problem. Don't bother coming back if it's a minute late." Aria wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him that the streets were turning into rivers, that it wasn't safe for a girl on foot. But she needed this job. It was the only thing standing between her family and the debt collectors. So she stepped outside into the deluge. The rain hit her like a physical weight, instantly soaking her through to the skin. The wind ripped at her hair, and the cold water turned her fingers numb within seconds. She made it barely 2 blocks before her knees buckled on the slick pavement. Aria collapsed, the high-value package clutched to her chest to keep it dry, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the shadows of the city closed in. From the safety of the dry office, her supervisor watched her fall and simply closed the blinds. What he didn't know, what he could never have guessed, was that a sleek armored sedan had just screeched to a halt at the corner. The man who stepped out of the back seat was a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of pure power. Kang Jun-seo, the most feared man in the Seoul underworld, ignored the rain soaking his tailored suit. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the small, shivering figure on the ground with a look of agonizing recognition. The woman dying in the rain was the only woman he had ever truly loved, and he had spent 1,000 days and nights hunting for her. The fluorescent lights of the restaurant's back office hummed with a clinical, irritating buzz that seemed to vibrate inside Aria's skull. She had been on her feet since 5 in the morning, her legs feeling like hollow pillars of lead, but in this room, her exhaustion was treated as a personal insult. Her supervisor, Mr. Choi, stood over his mahogany desk, his face flushed with a petty, unchecked rage. Between them lay a shattered porcelain vase, a rare import that Aria hadn't even touched. She had been halfway across the kitchen when it fell, yet Choi had spent the last 20 minutes pinning the cost of the broken inventory squarely on her shoulders. "Do you have any idea how many lifetimes it would take for a girl like you to pay for this?" Choi hissed, his voice cutting through the air like a serrated blade. He leaned in, the smell of stale coffee and expensive cigarettes cloying. "You're a ghost, Aria. You're lucky I even let you breathe the same air as our VIPs, but luck just ran out." Aria gripped the hem of her damp apron, her knuckles white. She wanted to tell him that her father's business had been sabotaged by people just like him, men who used their power to erase the small and the struggling. She wanted to tell him that her father was in a hospital bed because of the stress Choi heaped upon her every day. But if she spoke, she was finished. Choi reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined box. He shoved it toward her chest so hard she had to stumble back to catch it. "The storm is getting worse. The roads are blocked for the couriers," he sneered, glancing toward the window where the rain was now lashing against the glass with a violent, rhythmic thud. "This needs to be at the Northern District by midnight. It's a peace offering for a client who doesn't like to wait. You're going to walk it there." "Walk," Aria's voice was a dry rasp. "Mr. Choi, the flash flood warnings. The winds are over 60 kilometers. "Then you'd better start running," he interrupted, his eyes gleaming with the delight of a man who enjoyed grinding another person into the floor. "Deliver that package intact, or don't bother coming back tomorrow. And if you don't come back, don't expect a single one of your back pay to reach your father's clinic." Aria looked at the box, then at the door leading to the black, watery abyss of the Seoul streets. The weight in her arms wasn't just a package, it was the crushing gravity of her own survival. Without a word, she turned and stepped into the hallway. She didn't have a raincoat. She didn't have an umbrella. All she had was the desperate, trembling resolve of a woman who had already lost everything but her life. As she pushed open the heavy service door, the wind shrieked, welcoming her into the dark. The warmth was the first thing Aria felt, a heavy, suffocating heat that felt alien against skin that had just been carved by ice. When her eyes finally fluttered open, the harsh neon of Seoul's streets had been replaced by a dim, amber glow reflecting off floor-to-ceiling glass. She was lying on a silk-sheeted bed in a room that felt more like a fortress than a home, characterized by sharp angles, dark marble, and a silence so profound it made her ears ring. As the fog of exhaustion cleared, a shadow detached itself from the far wall. Aria's breath hitched, her heart thundering against her ribs. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the rain still lashing at the glass, was a man whose presence filled the room like a physical weight. He hadn't changed. The broad set of his shoulders and the regal, dangerous tilt of his head were burned into her mind from 1,000 dreams she had tried to bury. Kang Jun-seo turned. The soft light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the cold, predatory intensity in his eyes that had once looked at her with warmth, but now held only a terrifying, controlled stillness. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rumble that sent a shiver of pure dread and recognition down her spine. Aria struggled to sit up, the silk sheets sliding against her damp, bandaged skin. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice sounding thin and broken. "The package I have to deliver, The package is at the bottom of the Han River for all I care," Jun-seo interrupted, stepping into the light. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, though his hands were clenched tightly at his sides. "You were dying, Aria. You were 3 minutes away from your heart stopping in a gutter while your supervisor watched from a dry office." Aria flinched at the mention of her boss, the reality of her life crashing back in. But the man standing before her was a far greater storm. She looked at the tailored suit, the glint of a gold watch, and the sheer, lethal authority he radiated. He was no longer the mysterious man she had loved in the shadows. He was the iron tiger of the Seoul underworld. "You left," she whispered, her pride flaring through the pain. She gripped the edge of the mattress, refusing to look small in his presence. 3 years of silence. You threw me away like I was nothing, and now you bring me here, to this den. Jun-seo's gaze darkened, a flicker of something raw and agonizing passing through his eyes before he masked it with ice. He walked toward the bed, the air between them thick with a tension so sharp it felt like a blade. "I didn't bring you here to talk about the past," he lied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he leaned over her. "I brought you here because I am the only person in this city who can keep you alive. And whether you hate me or not, you aren't leaving this room until the debt for your life is settled." The silence in the room was a living thing, thick with the weight of 3 years of unanswered questions. Aria stared at Jun-seo, her vision blurring not from the storm, but from the sudden, sharp proximity of the man who had been a ghost in her life for over 1,000 days. She looked at his hands, scarred, steady, and capable of great violence and great tenderness, and felt a flare of indignation that burned hotter than her fever. "You speak of debts," Aria's voice trembling. She pushed herself further upright, the motion sending a jagged spike of pain through her bruised side. She hissed through her teeth but didn't back down. "You left me in a cafe in Myeongdong with a goodbye that wasn't even a word. You vanished while my father's business was being picked apart by vultures, and now you want to play the savior because I tripped in the rain." Jun-seo's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking in his cheek. He stood at the edge of the bed, a monolith of dark fabric and repressed emotion. "I left to ensure those vultures didn't pick you apart too," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "The men I fight don't just take businesses, Aria. They take lives. I made myself a ghost so you wouldn't become one." "And look at me now," Aria shot back, gesturing to her torn, mud-stained uniform. "I'm working for a man who treats me like a dog, living in a basement flat, and running through flash floods because I can't afford to lose a single day's pay. Your protection felt a lot like a slow death sentence." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the world tilting dangerously as she stood. Her ankle, swollen and purple from her fall, buckled instantly. Before she could hit the floor, Jun-seo was there. His hands gripped her upper arms, his touch searing through the thin silk of the robe he had placed her in. The physical contact was an electric shock, a memory of a time when his touch meant safety, not a gilded cage. "Let go," she breathed, her hands flat against his chest, feeling the hard, frantic thud of his heart. "You can't even walk," he growled, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, hidden hunger. "Stop fighting me for 1 second. I would rather crawl back into that storm than stay in a house built on the blood you spilled to stay away from me," Aria said, her voice cracking. She shoved against him with the last of her strength, retreating toward the door despite the agony in her leg. "I don't want your money, Jun-seo. I don't want your villa. I want the 3 years you stole from me, and since you can't give me that, stay out of my way." She reached the door, her fingers fumbling with the heavy handle, leaving Jun-seo standing in the center of the room. He didn't follow her, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of defeat. It was the look of a hunter who knew the prey had nowhere else to go. While Aria limped through the sprawling corridors of the villa, desperate to find an exit, she stumbled into a room that looked less like a living space and more like a tactical command center. The air here was cool and hummed with the soft whirring of high-end servers. A wall of monitors cast a flickering blue light over the faces of 3 men in charcoal suits, their eyes fixed on scrolling data and high-definition street feeds. Aria froze as her own name flickered across a screen, followed by a grainy image of her father's hospital records. Next to it, a dossier had been opened on Mr. Choi. She watched, paralyzed, as one of the men clicked a key and a live feed of the restaurant appeared. It was surreal to see the familiar dining room from this clinical, predatory angle. She saw Choi at his desk, laughing into a telephone, completely unaware that his life was being dissected by ghosts. "Tax evasion, offshore gambling, and 3 counts of wage theft," one of the men reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "We've already frozen his primary credit line. By morning, his suppliers will start demanding immediate payment. He won't have enough liquid cash to pay the morning electricity bill." "Good," a voice rumbled from behind her. Aria spun around to find Jun-seo standing in the doorway. He didn't look like the man who had held her with trembling hands moments ago. He looked like a king directing a siege. He didn't look at her. He looked at the screens, his eyes cold and calculating. "Check his personal accounts again," Jun-seo commanded. "I want to know who he's paying to keep the medical board quiet about Aria's father. Find the link, then sever it." "Jun-seo, stop," Aria whispered, her voice caught between horror and awe. She realized then that this was the world he had tried to keep her from, a world where people were reduced to data points and enemies were erased without a single drop of blood being spilled. You can't play God with people's lives." Jun-seo finally turned to her. The blue light of the monitors sharpened the angles of his face, making him look like a statue of ice. "He played with yours for a year, Aria. He sent you into a storm to die for a velvet box. I'm not playing God. I'm just balancing the scales." The efficiency of it terrified her. In her world, justice was a slow, grinding machine that often broke down before it reached people like her. In Jun-seo's world, justice was a silent strike from the dark. She looked at the men in suits, then back at the man she once loved, realizing that the gap between them was no longer just 3 years of silence. It was a dark, bottomless abyss of power that she was already falling into. The golden warmth of the small cafe in Myeongdong had felt like an island of peace 3 years ago, a world away from the cold reality Jun-seo navigated every day. He remembered the way the steam from Aria's coffee had curled around her face, and how her laughter had been the only sound that could silence the constant, violent static in his mind. But that night, the peace had been a lie. His phone had vibrated against his thigh, a single, coded alert that meant the perimeter had been breached. His rival's scouts hadn't just found his safe house, they had followed him to her. Through the rain-streaked window of the cafe, Jun-seo had spotted the telltale flicker of a long-range lens from a rooftop across the street. They weren't looking for a hit on him, not yet. They were documenting the one thing that made the Iron Tiger vulnerable. They were measuring the distance between his heart and Aria's smile. "Jun-seo, you've gone quiet," Aria had said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He had pulled away as if her skin were white-hot iron. He knew the rules of the underworld. Anything you love is a hostage waiting to be taken. If he stayed another hour, they would snatch her the moment he stepped into his car. If he told her the truth, she would become an accomplice, hunted by the police and the syndicates alike. To keep her heart beating, he had to break it. He had to make her hate him so deeply that she would never go looking for him, never wander into the crosshairs of his life again. "I'm done with this," he had said, his voice as flat and cold as a tombstone. He didn't look at her. He couldn't, or the mask would shatter. "This was a distraction, Aria, a mistake. My life is starting now, and there's no room in it for a waitress with dreams of a white picket fence." The sound of her sharp, pained intake of breath had been worse than any gunshot. He had walked out of that cafe into a freezing downpour, his back turned to her sobbing, and climbed into the back of a waiting car. He had watched her through the rearview mirror until she was just a small, trembling speck in the rain. "Sir," his driver had asked that night, "should we take care of the scouts on the roof?" "No," Jun-seo had replied, his eyes dead and staring ahead. "Let them see me leave alone. Let them see that she means nothing to me." He had spent the next 3 years at war, building a throne of shadows, all while the ghost of that night burned in his chest. He had paid for her safety with his soul, never realizing that by saving her life, he had left her to starve in the world he forced her back into. Now, standing in the cold blue light of his command center, the cost of that safety felt heavier than ever. The retribution began not with a roar, but with a series of quiet, devastating clicks in the dark. While Aria slept a fitful, medicated sleep in the upstairs wing of the villa, Jun-seo sat in the glow of the monitors, watching the world of Mr. Choi burn. He didn't need to lift a finger against the man physically. In the modern age, a man's reputation was his jugular, and Jun-seo knew exactly where to bite. By 8:00 a.m., the first cracks appeared. An anonymous tip, backed by untraceable digital ledgers, landed on the desks of the National Tax Service. It detailed 5 years of systematic embezzlement and wage theft that Choi had hidden behind shell companies. Simultaneously, a video file was leaked to the restaurant's board of directors, footage from the previous night showing Choi laughing as he forced a shivering, exhausted Aria into a lethal storm. Jun-seo watched the live feed of the restaurant's back entrance. Mr. Choi arrived in his polished silver sedan, stepping out with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. He didn't even make it to the front door. 2 investigators from the Financial Crimes Division were already waiting. As the handcuffs clicked into place, a crowd of staff and morning commuters gathered, their phones raised like silent judges. Choi's face drained of color, his jaw hanging slack as the investigators began reciting the list of his fallen empires. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a black sedan idling across the street, the same sedan that had shadowed Aria through the rain. Jun-seo rolled down the tinted window just an inch. Let the man see the cold, lethal promise in his eyes for a single heartbeat, and then rolled it back up. By noon, Choi's assets were frozen. His prestigious club memberships were revoked, and his name was trending on social media as the face of corporate cruelty. He had been stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity in less than 4 hours. "Is it enough?" his lieutenant asked, standing in the shadows behind Jun-seo. Jun-seo watched Choi being shoved into the back of a police van, the man's expensive suit now wrinkled and stained. "It is a start," Jun-seo replied, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "But he hasn't felt the cold yet. Ensure the inmates in his holding cell know exactly how he treats the women who work for him. I want him to understand what it feels like to be truly alone in a storm." He turned away from the screen, the blue light fatting from his face. The bully had fallen, but as Jun-seo looked toward the stairs where Aria rested, he knew that tearing down a monster was easy. The real war was earning the forgiveness of the angel he had left in the rain. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and the lingering electricity of the storm. Aria stood before the restaurant's service entrance, her legs trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the weight of the envelope in her hand. It was a formal resignation, a piece of paper that represented the first breath of freedom she had taken in a year. She didn't want Jun-seo's money or his shadows. She wanted her life back on her own terms. But as she stepped into the alley, she didn't find the usual bustling prep crew. Instead, she found chaos. Mr. Choi was there, disheveled and wild-eyed, standing by his silver sedan as workers whispered in huddles. He hadn't been processed yet. He was out on a frantic, temporary bail, and his world was screaming. When his eyes landed on Aria, the desperation turned into a toxic, jagged rage. "You," he shrieked, lunging toward her before his lawyers could intervene. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and realized it was staring back. "You did this. You and whatever filth you're sleeping with. You think you can ruin me? You're a waitress, you're nothing." He grabbed Aria's wrist, his grip bruisingly tight, the resignation letter fluttering to the wet asphalt. "You're going to call them off. You're going to tell the investigators it was a lie, or I'll make sure you and your pathetic father end up in the street by sunset." Aria didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. "It's over, Mr. Choi. I'm quitting, and you're going to jail." Choi raised his hand, a blind, panicked violence taking over, but he never finished the motion. The roar of a high-performance engine drowned out his scream as 3 black SUVs swerved into the alley, pinning his sedan against the brick wall. The doors opened in perfect, terrifying unison. A dozen men in charcoal suits stepped out, forming a living wall around Aria. The air pressure in the alley seemed to drop as Kang Jun-seo stepped into the light. He didn't look like a businessman or a former lover. He looked like the end of the world. "Get your hand off her," Jun-seo said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made the surrounding air feel thin. Choi's grip slackened as he looked at the sigil on the lead SUV, the mark of the Kang syndicate. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He hadn't just bullied an employee, he had laid hands on the Iron Tiger's heart. Jun-seo walked forward, his presence forcing everyone, the lawyers, the staff, the police standing by to fall back in a wave of silent awe. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Aria's bruised wrist, then at Choi. "I was going to let the law have you," Jun-seo whispered, a sound more terrifying than a shout. "But you just changed the terms of your surrender." In that moment, the secret was gone. The world saw the nothing girl protected by the most dangerous man in Seoul, and Aria realized that while her cage had been broken, she had walked straight into a kingdom of shadows. The transition from the restaurant alley to the industrial graveyard of the Incheon shipyards happened in a blur of violence and cold steel. Aria hadn't even reached the safety of Jun-seo's SUV before the betrayal struck. It wasn't an outside enemy, but Han, Jun-seo's trusted second-in-command, who turned the barrel of his gun toward his own men. In the confusion of smoke and screeching tires, Aria was shoved into a speeding van, the scent of ozone and sea salt filling her lungs as the world went black. When she came to, she was bound to a rusted chair inside a cavernous shipping container, the metal walls groaning under the force of the gale outside. Han stood before her, his face a mask of bitter ambition. "He's weak because of you, Aria," Han hissed, checking his watch. "The Iron Tiger is burning down his own kingdom just to keep you warm. I'm simply putting him out of his misery." A roar like a wounded beast echoed through the shipyard. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse were torn open as Jun-seo's sedan leaped over the debris, tires screaming against the concrete. Before the car even stopped, Jun-seo was out, moving with a lethal, terrifying grace. The air exploded. A rain of bullets hammered against the shipping containers, sparks flying like lethal fireflies in the dark. Jun-seo didn't dive for cover. He moved through the crossfire with a singular, desperate focus. He was a man possessed, his tailored suit tattered, his eyes fixed on the container where Aria was held. Han's men fell one by one, silenced by the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose but the woman in the center of the storm. "Jun-seo, stop!" Aria screamed as a bullet grazed the metal inches from her head. Jun-seo reached the container, his breath coming in ragged, white clouds. Han stepped out from behind Aria, pressing a cold muzzle to her temple. The gunfire ceased, leaving only the sound of the wind and the frantic thud of two hearts. "Drop it, boss," Han taunted, his hand trembling. "Choose the throne or the girl." Jun-seo didn't hesitate. He tossed his weapon into the dark, the heavy thud of the metal echoing like a death knell. He stood defenseless in the rain of his own empire's collapse, his hands raised, his gaze locked onto Aria's tear-filled eyes. "I already chose 3 years ago," Jun-seo whispered, his voice steady even as Han's finger tightened on the trigger. "The throne means nothing if the world is empty of you." In that moment of pure, agonizing tension, Aria saw the man behind the monster, the boy who had loved her in a cafe, now willing to die in a shipyard just to hold her hand one last time. The chaos of the shipyard was silenced not by a final gunshot, but by the weight of a choice that changed the history of the Seoul underworld forever. In the days following the ambush, the name Kang Jun-seo vanished from the ledgers of the syndicates. He didn't just walk away. He dismantled the throne he had spent a lifetime building, handing over the keys of his empire to those who still hungered for power, on the one condition that they never spoke Aria's name again. 6 months later, the violent neon glare of Gangnam felt like a distant memory. The air here, in a small coastal town far from the city's reach, smelled of salt spray and blooming jasmine instead of ozone and wet asphalt. Aria stood at the window of a modest, sun-drenched cafe, watching the morning light dance across the calm blue water. Her father was in the garden behind the shop, his strength returning more each day, far away from the threats of debt and the shadows of cruel supervisors. The bell above the door chimed, a soft, welcoming sound. Aria didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, frantic atmosphere that had once followed Jun-seo had been replaced by a quiet, steady presence. He no longer wore the tailored armor of a mafia king. Today, he wore a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars that were finally starting to fade. "The deliveries are finished," Jun-seo said, his voice no longer a terrifying rumble but a warm, grounded melody. He stepped up beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, not a tentative touch born of fear but a solid, permanent anchor. Aria turned to him, seeing the man she had loved in the cafe 3 years ago, finally returned from the war. There were no black sedans waiting at the corner, no earpieces buzzing with news of betrayal. There was only the sound of the waves and the peaceful hum of a life they had earned with their own blood. "You're late," she teased softly, reaching out to lace her fingers through his. Jun-seo looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing the line of her palm with a reverence that made her heart ache. "I spent 3 years being late, Aria. I'm never leaving again." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers as the morning sun flooded the room, washing away the last lingering shadows of the storm. The iron tiger was gone, and the woman who had collapsed in the rain was finally whole. Behind them, the ruins of their past were buried under the tide. Ahead of them, the path was wide, bright, and silent, a new beginning built on the simple, impossible survival of a love that refused to stay in the dark. As the sun climbed higher, the rain felt like it had belonged to another lifetime entirely.